Okay, so just let me know whenever you get ready for me to screen share and all of that stuff, and we can I'll go ahead.
All right, so welcome to day two of Africana Studies Week, a week of learning and engaging and reflecting on a body of knowledge and lots of cultural orientations of people across the African diaspora. I appreciate you for being here and supporting tonight's program, and thank you for attending all of the things that we've done so far. We had a great keynote presentation on teaching Blackness while under attack with Dr. Oba Tushaka, Professor Emeritus at San Francisco State University, and home of the first Department of Black Studies in this country. And earlier this afternoon, we had a really fun African aesthetics program exploring fashion and fabric with Dr. Charlotte Keenan and Ms. Sarah Wilmot. We got to learn a lot about the cultural significance of clothing and fabrics and colors, and we were even able to take some of the fabric samples home for our own projects. So tonight we are going to be talking about the concept of ma'at in the context of understanding balance and wellness. I've been fascinated by the endless discussions about wellness that have very little to actually do with wellness and more to do with a lot of commercialization and profit in a wellness industry. And so I've asked one of our best and brightest community teachers to come and talk a little bit about wellness from an African-centered perspective and focusing specifically on the concept of ma'at, and I think you'll enjoy it. Lamar Ford was raised in Stedman, North Carolina, and now lives in Richmond, Virginia. As a child in the early 1980s, he developed an affinity for African cultures and pursued this appreciation for his ancestry with more intensity as an adult. He earned an associate's degree in information systems technology, and it was during his college years that he first started learning Medu our African language of the Nile Valley. And he began to study at the Kemetic Institute of Philology. Shout out to our Sabat, Mut Raketi Amen, Baba Banachi Montgomery, and all of the others there who center our language and our culture. He utilizes his love of the natural world to augment his studies by studying Africa's flora, fauna, and natural phenomenon to better understand the Medu script and to place Kemet back into its African context. So I'm going to turn it over to you. And once the presentation is complete, we'll have some opportunity for discussion and also for question and answer.
Duau Sabat Brandy. I just want y'all to know I did not pay Brandy for anything that she just said. So that's all her. And I appreciate the warm welcome and the introduction. I hope that you guys are edified by what I have for you today. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Brandy, is my screen showing up? Y'all good? You can see? Okay. All right.
Yes, we
So,
can see it.
okay. All right. The name, the title of my talk today is The Philosophy of Ma'at. What is Ma'at and what did it mean to our African ancestors? Okay, before we get started, I'm going to give praise and veneration to my dearly departed ancestors by evoking them. Inej, Heruchenu, I seek your faces, and may what I do today bring honor to your continuing names. And I write for you, I write for you with a clean hand. Now, we're going to start with what is Ma'at? And usually it's a really, really hard question to answer because people tend to want to just name aspects of Ma'at and trying to describe it. And we're going to go on a little journey today trying to figure out what Ma'at is and what it's not. That's basically the premise for today. So what I offer just, and I offer this not as a rigid definition, but more so just something that you can think about as we're going on this journey today. So just in a very short nutshell type of description of Ma'at, I describe it as the engagement of the functionality of nature. I tend to just leave it at that because that covers pretty much every aspect of the natural world. And to quote my Seba, Baba Banachi, what is nature? Nature is just the environment in which reality kind of engages itself. Just a really simple definition. Now, as far as the other side of the screen here, we have Isfet. Isfet, basically, some people would say that it's evil. That would be, by my estimation, one aspect of Isfet. I tend to look at it as just being the opposite of what Ma'at is, or in other words, being disengaged with how nature functions. Just a simple terminology that we can use in a simple description so that we can tell these two concepts apart from one another. And that's going to be really important as we go forward. Some people will describe, Ma'at as truth, justice, righteousness, reciprocity, harmony, balance, order, those types of things. Those are aspects of Ma'at. You could say that, but I think trying to how could I put it? Trying to limit Ma'at to just one word or even 100 words, I think would be an effort in futility. So I do not venture to do that here. Okay. So now to get down to the meat and potatoes, what we came here to talk about, with this mindfulness topic that we have, I find that trying to couple Ma'at with it and previous sort of like new age movements that we have is extremely problematic. And I'm going to get into why briefly. But I'm going to focus in this presentation on aspects of Ma'at that are actually tangible and that we can actually see. So we're going to get into some other stuff, but I'm going to deal with this very briefly first. Now, in this article about, let me go back. In this article about cultural appropriation from Maisha Z. Johnson, and I apologize if I'm butchering the name, but she talks about how cultural appropriation happens with yoga, for example, in Western spaces, because yoga is like a big part of this mindfulness movement and a lot of these new age movements to start with. But she makes a note here about, East Africa's Kemetic yoga. And so in the author's note that she utilizes, and she writes in this article that it emphasizes the South Asian roots of yoga, but she celebrates and acknowledges the deep roots in Kemetic yoga from East Africa. The reason why I wanted to highlight this really quickly is, and I'm not saying this to disparage this sister because she's trying to do a good thing. So I'm not really putting this on her. I'm just saying that there is no such thing as deep roots in Kemetic yoga from East Africa. That does not exist. There is no text where we can see a description of this. And there is really no reason for us to think that when you use the term Kemetic yoga, in some ways, if you're talking about a physical fitness system, that's inspired by Kemet and some of the poses that we see on the walls and things like that, I have no problem with that, as long as we keep it in a contemporary sense. But if we make the claim that the walls in Kemet have yoga poses and that people were doing them, that is where it gets a little problematic, because there's supposition there. And one of the things that happens is these images of these figures who are contorted and things like that, they're often separated from the text that surrounds them, and that's extremely problematic. And in some instances, I would go so far as to say that it's disingenuous and dishonest, because when it comes to the images that we see on the walls, you never separate them from the writing. And once you deal with the writing around these images that they say are yoga poses, you find really quickly that they have nothing to do with yoga at all. So, like I said, I'm not disparaging the sister or anything like that. I'm just saying that, when we're talking about the material culture, we just don't see evidence of this. And when we go into the more Indian philosophy and the different aspects of it, because there's lots of different systems in this Eastern, in the older Eastern philosophical studies and endeavors. But I wanted to point out something really, really quickly. A lot of the adherents that we have who are African descent to these types of programs and disciplines, you find them in all different types of people who engage in different things, especially in the Abrahamic traditions. But according to the ancient traditions that we have coming out of India, one of the things that happens is that they don't really deal with God as like the creator of the universe. They have a different standard for that, right? And for African people, especially in the diaspora and especially here in America, this once again becomes problematic because according to the Abrahamic traditions, you are not supposed to be engaging in these things to start with. It's a direct conflict of interest because these systems do not recognize the God that you worship. So, but these types of things people tend to ignore, even if you make them aware of it, which is, once again, is problematic. If you have to do that, you're essentially lying to yourself, right? And it aids and abets confusion in a lot of different ways. Just like this excerpt from a book I read on the mindfulness movement in preparing for this. This particular quote references mindfulness as it's marketed here in the West, and in this particular section of the book, it talks about how the mindfulness movement really doesn't stop people from being racist or anti-African or any of those things that are central to the problems that we experience. So right then and there, we know that this mindfulness thing is really not the answer to our problems, right? And in this section, the author talks about this particular person who came forth with all of this gusto and this tends to happen with people that come from the East and they introduce certain things to the West as a part of like a money grab or just those types of superficial motivations, and they wow people with their rhetoric and their charisma and all of this, and none of it really keeps them from engaging, or their followers really from engaging in anti-African or racist rhetoric and endeavors and movements and all of these other kinds of things. So when we move to why these systems are harmful, there's a lot of different reasons why these types of movements are harmful, because at their roots, they promote white supremacy and are prone to racist narratives, just off the rip, because obviously you're talking about Eastern systems that are brought into the West. And even with that transition, a lot of the Easternness of it that's not considered exotic enough gets removed and repackaged and put into something that can be sold to people that's provocative enough to make them want to put money into it. Because we know when we're talking about these movements, you're talking about billion-dollar industries, right? But obviously you can't go too far with it. And so, but the main thing is that for us is that there's a dearth of African perspective and worldview. Even when they start to try to incorporate Kemet and other stuff into it, it's just the stuff that's shiny, they gravitate to that. And that's about it. It's a surface level interaction, and it really doesn't help African people anywhere. The next thing is the prioritization of an African-centered self is met with hostility and ostracization. That's something that you see anytime you try to self-determine in spaces that consider themselves even to be like liberal and progressive and things like that. It's like you're not allowed to fully identify as an African. There's limits put on you because you don't really control these movements. And the last one here is there's an abstract centered focus instead of things that are actually tangible. When you can just kind of throw things up into the air and make them be what you want them to be, that doesn't really do a lot, because these things are just abstract. They can be whatever you want them to be. And one of the problems is when you're trying to develop understanding and you're dealing with a person who is engaging in these systems and you ask them questions that they can't answer, that's what always happens. They throw it back up into the air. And when you're dealing with abstraction, you never have to be responsible for the things you say. And a person like that is automatically dangerous and against your overall well-being. So we get into this rhetoric that we see in these movements about the higher self and the lower self, right? And this is also problematic because it causes complacency, for one, in asserting an African-centered identity. It immediately puts at odds, it's immediately put at odds with past struggles for self-determination, often attained through necessary violence. Think about some of our great ancestors like Nat Turner, and you think about things like the Stono Rebellion, for example, and even some of the more modern implementations of necessary violence, like during the civil rights movement and subsequent things, but also during the rebellions that we had during slavery, during the chattel slavery period. And you could even take that back into Africa, and with the rebellions that in the triangular slave trade in the West, as well as the Islamic slave trade. There were constant rebellions, and we were constantly fighting these people. When you get into this whole higher self thing, and you're going to find yourself at odds with that kind of stuff, and it's really, really dangerous to an African-centered identity, because these people tend to, which I'll get into that in a moment, so I'm going to save that. But you have to ask, are the concepts of the higher self and lower self useful in an African context? I would tell you absolutely not, because when you engage with a system like Ma'at takes in account what makes everything within reality, what governs everything in reality, what makes this work, what makes that work. All of that is accounted for. And in these systems where people start talking about a higher self and a lower self, none of that really applies to an African-centered worldview, because you would have to determine what's a high self and a low self in an African context. Nobody's ever been able to tell me that. And I've asked a lot of these people, like, what does that mean? And I've never gotten a straight answer. That's enough to tell me that, it's not something that I should deal with. And, so we're going to go to the next one. And this one, there's a touted moral superiority that goes on with these type of movements. And there's no room that's allowed to call into question other concepts, such as intersectionality, representation, feminism, things like that never really attempt to consult other cultures. And they demand that other people from these cultures adhere to these concepts. So when you talk about a concept like intersectionality or representation, you're not the ones who are controlling the intersection or the representation. So just by that alone, self-determination is not pushed to the forefront, because you have another group of people who are telling you how you're supposed to identify and what parameters of your African self they're comfortable with, which obviously is no good to any of us. Now, when we look at a few of these people from the past who are responsible for a lot of this new age rhetoric that we see coming from the late 60s, early 70s, and into today in its different iterations. These are a few of the people whose works are propped up by these types of movements. And you can obviously see one thing that all of these people have in common, for one. Another thing that they all have in common is their ideas about race and their ideas about African people are pretty much parallel, and none of them are good. This is something that I don't have time to go into today, but these are just a few names you can check out. I will say Franz Mesmer in particular If his name looks familiar to you, he's the person where the term mesmerized comes from, because he was one of these people that was into this whole thing about animal magnetism. I remember when I was growing up, that was like a common thing that was in pop culture, so the animal magnetism thing. So um, now to bring it more into the modern day, these are modern day people who espouse these types of ideas, and they profit heavily from miseducating African people, and also from miseducating other non-African people about African people, going so far as to exclude African people from our own agency and our achievements, and just by doing and saying a lot of nefarious things. I'm not going to get into their individual deals because, like I said, I just don't have time. And I don't want to spend too much time on this section, but I do have to do away with it so that I can get into the other stuff that I wanted to get into. So we're going to deal with really, really quickly this particular book, Chariots of the Gods. It came out in the late 60s by, it was quote unquote written, and I'm using heavy air quotes here, by Eric von Daniken. And I use the air quotes here because we're going to get into the influence that this book had on these new age movements and still has. So Eric von Daniken was a guy who made a lot of money scamming people in the hotel business and things like that. And so he decided he was going to write this book. And he wrote the book as it talks about here in this German publication from 1969, that his book was obviously rejected because he didn't know how to write. And so what ended up happening was he enlisted the help of a man named Wilhelm Rogersdorf, and he was the editor, but he ended up being the co-author. And then later he ended up basically being the author because he had to rewrite this book. Now, Wilhelm Rogersdorf was an actual journalist, but this is where it actually gets interesting, because we're going to deal with who Wilhelm Rogersdorf actually was. Now, if you're familiar with this book, Chariots of the Gods, he put forth a lot of this ancient alien and ancient technology information and all of this other kind of stuff that aimed to take the achievements away from African people in a lot of different ways. And his book is one of the fundamental texts of a lot of these new age interpretations of history. Now, but back to Wilhelm Rogersdorf, let's deal with who he is really quickly. Now, I went to the German National Library to get this information, and his actual name is, as you can see here, his actual name is Wilhelm Udermann. Okay. And as you can see here, he was the editor of numerous titles by Eric von Daniken and other authors under the pseudonym of, let me go back, under the pseudonym Wilhelm Rogersdorf. Okay. And this is very important. And I'm going to show you why on this very next slide, because of who he was. In this publication, basically translated, it's basically means modern lust. They talk about him and his work in television, and so he was enlisted to help with this program post in Germany, post the Third Reich and all of that. And you can see here clearly that this is what was Wilhelm Udermann was a Nazi propagandist. So he was a Nazi, and he worked for a paper during the Third Reich era of Germany. So a lot, and we know for a fact that Hitler was into a lot of this ancient alien UFO religion stuff. He was heavy into that stuff. And if you've read his book, Mein Kampf, you'll know that in the 7th chapter, I think, he actually goes into detail about why he targeted Jewish people for extermination. And it was because he blamed them for bringing African people into Germany. And it's also important to know that African people were also targeted for extermination during the same time that the Jewish Holocaust was happening, not in the same numbers, because there wasn't as many of us there. But obviously this ancient alien, this UFO stuff that pops up in the 70s and all of this other stuff, it actually, when people espouse that today in whatever form they do it in, they're engaging in Nazisms, like full stop. You can't separate the two. All right. So, you know, obviously, to close this section out, to bring it to a close, we had the concept of Isfet, as I talked about earlier. New Age religion, hijacking indigenous cultures, Isfet. Hebrews, aliens built the Meru, Isfet. Medu Neter hasn't been deciphered, Isfet. Pseudo history that overwrites African legacy, Isfet. Sumer gave writing to Kemet, Isfet. Sub-Saharan Africa, Sub-Saharan African, Isfet. Dynastic race theory, Isfet. Kemet roots in the Levant, Isfet. UFOs in antiquity, Isfet. Samboisms, the African people who love this kind of material and can't get enough of it and propagate this stuff, Isfet. It's full stop. There's no way around it. All right. So now what we're going to do is, now that I've dealt with that, I wanted to get into the practicality of the concept of Ma'at. We're going to talk about how far back it actually goes and how we can actually use Ma'at today. So I'm going to deal with the inspirations that later become Ma'at, and we're going to go on that journey again, and we're going to go through some material culture. So ostrich eggs as geological and social time capsules. Ostrich eggs were useful materials by early Africans because they have their ostrich eggshells. They consist of 3 layers of a crystalline form of calcite. So basically, it makes them really, really resistant to breaking, even though, you can break them. The best way to do it is to do it on the side, which we'll demonstrate here in a moment. But this makes them really good vessels for water bottles, for example, which is how they were used in prehistoric Africa. Now, with this particular part, they actually do a really good job of telling you what was going on as far as the climate, because obviously ostriches are herbivores, so they eat certain plants and stuff, and the composition of the ostrich eggs they produce, you can see what they were eating just based on that, and the type of, just like any other animal, so not only do they give us a lot of information about people, they also give us a lot of information about what the climate was like in the area that we find them during the time that we find them. So even just looking at these old ostrich shards, the eggs from the shards from the ostrich eggs, it tells us a lot about what African people were doing. But it also, we see how ostrich eggshells played a role in the development of animals, for example, because the vulture here is normally called the Egyptian vulture, or the pharaoh chicken. You'll know it as, if you read Medu Neter, you study the script, you'll know it as the bird from G1 in the Garden of Sign list. This bird developed, and it evolved to be able to use tools. It's one of the few birds that we have a record for that can actually use tools. And basically what they do is they dive bomb these ostrich shells with stones by turning them on the side at the widest part of the egg where they're most vulnerable. And they dive bomb them with these stones until they crack and they eat the insides, because they're small vultures. They're really, really small birds. So their talons and their beaks aren't strong enough to crack the egg on their own. So just the fact of the hardiness of the ostrich egg aids and abets the evolution of wildlife to be able to use tools. That's just a really significant piece of biohistory. Now we're going to get into the social order of the ostrich and its relation to the African communal concept, so we can start to see how this concept, develops. When we go into the Cape region of Africa, in these ancient settlements, one thing that we see that you have these shellfish eaters, and they're starting, the water at the Cape region especially starts to go back out, and it exposes a lot of that area where human beings normally couldn't inhabit or get to because the water was too deep. So they venture out into the water a little bit, and they find these oysters and these shellfish and things like that. This is important because the necessity for creating tools happens because with an oyster, for example, or just shellfish like that, if you needed to get into an oyster, it's not possible to get into one with your bare hands. You have to have a tool. So just these shellfish eaters, these early shellfish eaters, um, they're associated, and the shellfish themselves. So we've all heard about fish and stuff being brain food. We actually have evidence to support that now scientifically. And where we find these shellfish, where these people were eating these shellfish and made them a part of their diet, we also find in the substratum these ostrich shells. And this is important because these ostrich shells started to play a part in symbolic thought, right? And what ends up happening is, as I'm about to demonstrate, we go into, just to bring it up a couple 100,000 years, we go into the 60s, and Charles Levi Strauss, he wrote this book called The Savage Mind. Of course, he didn't have anything flattering to say about African people, of course, but just like always with scientific racism, a lot of times they'll give you a little bit of the truth, and then they'll take that and they'll just create this narrative that really does us no good, right? And this is the kernel of truth that he utilized to demonstrate that African people were savages. But he talks about this mytho-geographical system that we find from the Niger Valley, and it makes its way into the Sudan. And when they're studying these cultures and stuff, what ends up happening is they find out that there's evidence that these languages have relationships. So they're talking about diachronic and synchronic. So that's just a fancy way of saying we see evolutionary relationships with the language, and also we see like modern day relationships with the language. So and we now know from evidence that we have from last year, we now know that he was 100% correct, because we can demonstrate that now. We have evidence of a social network, and you can see how it works here. That goes back, at this point, it goes back 50,000 years. I suppose that it's probably going to be pushed back even further with more research. So you can see the type of area going back 50,000 years ago, the type of area that it covers. You have these people that are talking to one another. And we're not just talking trade, because that's usually when it comes to Africa and you start seeing relationships between different people, the first thing people say is, oh, they were trading. No, this right here goes a little further beyond trading, because ultimately what we're talking about is the sharing of ideas. So, trading is one thing. You have ideas that are shared through trading, but what we're talking about is you're talking about cultural relationships. And so we have these people groups that were in contact with one another, and they were exchanging information over long distances, just like we're doing right now, right? The thing about it that's so brilliant about this is they didn't need the internet to do it, right? So as far as I'm concerned, this is one of mankind's greatest achievements, and you'll be hearing more about this in the coming years. And I suspect that the range of this will probably be expanded with more research. Now, one thing that I wanted to get into as well is I wanted to talk really, really quickly about the direction that these ideas moved in. Now, this is an image of the Hopi River Basin. Now, I know a lot of us, when we talk about the Hopi River Basin, it tends to be associated just within the borders of Kemet, and it would have you believe that the most fertile part of especially when people start making arguments about agriculture, it would have you believe that the base of this fertile soil is in the Delta. The fact of the matter is that obviously, just from looking at this, the Delta region and the basin part in Kemet is the smallest part of the Hopi Basin. The largest part is found in an area that covers both sections of the Sudan. It goes into Ethiopia, Eritrea, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, and even into the Congo. This is really important because remember, think about what I was saying earlier about the social network. These people in the wet phase of the Sahara, And during the Green Sahara period, these basins were really, really close to one another. And in some cases, they were like next door to one another. And you're talking about a series of lakes and streams that were crisscrossing Africa. Now, the reason why this is important here is because the fertile soil deposits, since the Hopi flows from south to north, the soil deposits for agriculture are what they would call time transgressive. In this particular instance, time transgressive, it just means that the direction that the movement of the river is going in, once you get to the end of that direction, the youngest soil deposits are going to be found there. And the oldest ones are going to be found in the direction that the water's coming from. So in this particular case, the fertile soil that's the youngest is actually found in the delta. And the impetus of what would later become Kemet is actually found in the south. And that includes the burgeoning physical properties of agriculture. And we can see here that these soil deposits, which also includes the silt, for example, that comes from the Ethiopian highlands, all of that stuff makes its way down the river. And it's because of that we end up with these settlements that later become in the Green Sahara phase that later become Kemet. Okay, so it's readily apparent that the civilization that we call Tawi in the early period, or Kenu, which would be called Kemet, of course, in the 11th dynasty, the agricultural impetus for it, and when you're talking about the physical sciences and the ecology, that comes from the south. It doesn't come from the north. Okay, that's an important point when you start to talk about the origins of the civilization. So I just wanted to touch on that so you could see the direction that these ideas were coming from, right? And so it could be contextualized with everything else. Now, once again, we're here talking about these pieces of the ostrich eggshells and how you're seeing people engraving and etching on the eggshells. And here it talks about how they're uniform in shape and dimensions. And then you have people, remember, think about what I was saying about the shellfish eaters and the beginnings of symbolic thought that's being recorded on actual material. So we see that with these ostrich eggshells. So the ostrich eggshells play a vital part in the development of the human brain, because what you ultimately have is symbolic thought being recorded on these eggshells. And that makes its way into that social network, which I don't have a slide for this, but this is just an aside. The social network was based around ostrich eggshell beads. And so that technology seems to have been founded in East Africa, is where it seems to come from. So that's also important when we talk about this concept of ma'at, because you actually have material culture displays that we're actually going to get into the purpose of them, that is still continuing today in other parts of Africa. So when you look at this particular map of the river basins and the different physical features of Africa, they talk about this open vegetation going back about 23,000 years ago. And so there was a dry phase, and ultimately you can see, that this is what was going on when people were starting to spread out. And it's just what ends up happening is you have these, when people take their ideas with them, you don't even have to put ideas in your pocket, you just take them with them. They're there wherever you go. That's the beautiful thing about ideas and concepts. And that's one of the ways that they can be shared across long distances. Now, I want to get into something really quick to put the focus on this. In the Meta Nature lexicon itself, this consonant cluster of N and W there's a lot of attestations I have some of the terminology here that demonstrates that this consonant cluster is associated with water in a lot of different ways. And there's cultural information in these terms, like Niu ostrich, Niu bowl. Think about what I was saying about the ostrich shells being the first water bowls before we have pottery. Niu, primeval waters, Niwet, the lower part of the sky. Obviously, this is the part of the sky that the rain comes from, right? Niwet, city, town, or village. So we're talking about an area where you either have access to irrigated water or you have direct access to natural water deposits, whether it be a river or a stream or a lake or whatever. New time. This is important, especially with Newt here, when you think about the metaphorical description of the sky as, an infinite mass of water. Okay, these are very important cultural ideas. And what I'm going to do in a moment is I'm going to actually offer a significance with this term to you with the ostrich being the name for the ostrich, because the name that actually means something else, and I'm going to show that to you in a moment. Now we can see some of these water scenes on the pots. Like, for example, we have the Nuet symbol down inside of the bowl with the water moving through it, and then you have these various water scenes that are inside of the pots. This is a common motif in the Nakata period. So we can actually see the relationship playing out with the consonant clusters that I was making reference to. So we're starting to see the development of these ideas. So in Kemet, obviously the ostrich was important while the ostrich was there, and we do have remnants of this important, obviously, in this concept of Ma'at, because the symbol of Ma'at is the ostrich feather, and we can see the importance of the ostrich even in the pyramid text, because the ostrich is requested to aid in the ascension of the Nisut, for example, because the waterway is described as being difficult to navigate. So the ostrich is asked to allow the Nisut to pass through the pyramid text. Now, this is where we start to get into this thing where we talk about Ma'at, and people in this mindfulness thing, they always talk about Ma'at as being like this really peaceful and harmonious thing, and that calls for, people, if you get angry or upset, or you have to be violent, that somehow that's outside of Ma'at. This is absolutely insane, and there's no validity to that argument whatsoever, and we're going to go through some of that now. Like, for example, the word for warrior or military is Mesha. You can look here and see the brother, the Zulu warrior wearing the ostrich feather headdress. This is a common element of military attire in Africa in general. You see it all over the place, and in Kemet it was no different. So there's a reason for that. Like the Nandi brother here, you see he has the headdress. His headdress is made of black and white ostrich feathers, and this is significant because we're actually seeing what I'm leading up to right now. And so when you see this ostrich feather is associated with being a warrior. Now, I'm going to offer this as a trigger warning because there's a graphic image behind this box, but it's necessary. So this is an injury that was inflicted on a human being by an ostrich. Ostriches have two toes, and one of them is for support, and the short one, and then there's a long toe that has a long talon on it, and that's the part of the ostrich you don't want to get anywhere near, because just like cassowaries that hop up and kick you, and ostriches, male ostriches, get to be about 9 feet tall. They don't have to hop up and kick you. They strike upwards and to the side, and then they come down. And their whole the purpose of that particular attack is to disembowel you. They always go for your torso, and especially the lower part of your torso, where all of your vital organs and stuff are. Now, they also will kick you, and the kick just itself is enough to send a grown person flying backwards several feet. The other thing that they do is that they'll knock you to the ground, and then because they have a breastplate, a chest plate that they use to knock you to the ground. And then once they knock you to the ground, they'll either kick you while you're on the ground, or they'll stomp you, and then sometimes they'll squat over you and peck at you to get to like things like your eyes and your nose and things like that. And ostriches that are in captivity are more dangerous than wild ostriches, because one of the things that happens is they lose their fear of human beings. So especially when you're in a cage or in a fence with an ostrich, there's nowhere you're going to run from them, because they run they max out at about 45 miles an hour when they get into a full run. They're faster than racehorses, so you're not getting away from one if one gets after you. Now this is important because ostriches mainly have two methods of defense. One of them is the outright attack, and then the other one is to, especially when their eggs are in danger of being crushed, they jump to this option, which they put their wings out, and they'll even chase away predators if they can, to keep them away from their eggs, especially with bigger animals like the buffalo here, who are just curious. They don't pose any threat to the eggs or anything, but obviously they're big enough to step on them and crush them. So the ostrich has to get them away, and they have no problem fleeing from the ostrich. Okay. And we have another trigger warning here, because this is actually the more common injury. So this brother here, he was repairing a fence. An ostrich came up and kicked him in his eye socket. Okay. And basically what ended up happening is everything from his nasal bone to the orbital walls around his the orbital walls and the area around his sinus. He got blunt trauma to his eye, couldn't operate on. The brother lost his eye. And this happens quite a bit with ostrich attacks on humans. They tend to occur more in captivity than in the wild, because obviously you have to go to where an animal is for it to attack you, or for you to attack it. So when you're closer to them, they're more dangerous. This is why I always tell people, a bull that's in a fence is more dangerous than like a bull that's in the wild, because those bulls, you're in there with them. They're not in there with you. So domesticating animals like this doesn't make them any less dangerous. In fact, it increases the danger. Now, we're going back to what I was saying about what the word ostrich, the word niu for ostrich probably means. There's a verb form, ni, which means to drive away, rebuff, or to throw down an enemy. Now, the talks that I just was giving you about the ostrich and its habits, its defense habits, were just described. So we have them throwing down enemies, or kicking them down, or just driving them off. So it's possible that the word niu for ostrich, is probably a participle, which the names for humans in Kemet tend to be participles. So there's no reason for us to think that animals would be different. So I posit that the word niu for ostrich really means the one who drives off or throws down predators or enemies. Okay. So the symbol of Ma'at is extremely violent. Okay. When necessary. And so this whole idea, this pie in the sky ideal about what Ma'at is, just cannot stand. Okay. And so we get into also more into some of the culture with the Pime dance, which is usually done with the ostrich feather. And the ostrich feather is so important that if one doesn't have one, they will borrow one in order to do the ritual and then to give it back. And this is important both in the variations of this that are male and female. Okay. And the reason why I wanted to point this out is because I'm gonna skip past this. No, I'm not. We'll see why that's important in a moment. But what we have here is a Nakata figure from Kemet from the pre-dynastic period. And there's a composite here of an ostrich, a cow, and an African woman. And this is important because all three of these are divine concepts. Now, the cow and the African woman tends to stay together, and we see it as Bat, and then later Hut Heru, or who the Greeks call Hathor. But it's possible that this ostrich motif comes off as it gets more important, and then it later becomes what we would call in Kemet Ma'at. Okay, and one of the reasons why I think this is the case is because there is no male complement to Ma'at that occupies the same role. Like, sure, she has Jehuti and depending on the time period, some other complements, but not in the way that we would see if you just had a particular concept involving an ostrich and then there was a masculine and a feminine counterpart. We see it with bulls, but not with ostriches. This is one of the reasons why I think that, but more research needs to be done on that. And this is important leading up to, consider posit is that African women are responsible for the advent of writing. And we see it in, I think, the pottery, and I think we can demonstrate this aspect of it. Brother Reggie is here, so he and I have been working on this for a while, and the pottery that we see here, this Nakata area of pottery, is at least one of the main transitional technologies. Pottery is the main transitional technology that moves writing from the rock art and the cave art and into what we call a Medu Neter. And I think that it's possible that this happens because the pottery, the technology of pottery in Africa comes from West Africa. And you're talking about going back into the middle of the 10th millennium BCE. And it makes its way over into Kemet. And I suspect that the pottery makers, which in Africa are almost exclusively women, that these pottery guilds ultimately end up passing down this tradition that we start to see the formation of words, and the pictographic value is not lost. And I think that's major, so I'm pretty much on board with the idea that African women invented writing. There's a lot more work that needs to be done on that, but that's where I'm going with it. Okay. And we can actually see elements of this on the pots. For example, we have Bot here on the standard, and it just so happens that her name, or the names of all of these netures, really are composed of the same elements that we would see later in the Medu Neter script. So at the very least, the standards are probably words. And so we have some more information coming up, about that, later as we work this out. But what I wanted to concentrate on here was the fact that in this African system, there's no fighting, there's no fragmentation, as Dr. Naeem Akbar would say. There's no fragmentation between men and women. We don't have that because, to be honest with you, we never had the luxury of that. It takes everybody doing it together and overcoming these environments and these adversities, which would have especially been important during the time that the desert was creeping into the Sahara. Now, as we can see here in this primary text from the Hequanaket letters, where Hequanaket's wife was being mistreated. So he asks the person who was mistreating his wife is, what is the nature of my existence together with you in a community? There is none if you do not respect for me, my wife. So he's literally calling into question and saying that that this is not what we do. If you mistreat my wife, or in other words, if you do not engage in ma'at, then we do not have a community. And this is a common element that you see in African cultures all over. Okay. And we're going to go real quick into ostriches' relationships with other animals. Ostriches, if you're doing conservation, ostriches tend to not be a very good indicator of the health of an ecosystem. But because conservation is a little different than just a thriving ecosystem that doesn't need conservation, right? If you're living in a thriving ecosystem and conservation isn't necessary, ostriches are the best thing to look at to see how healthy it is. And this is something that Africans have known for thousands of years. You know, it's just really apparent because when we get into relationships that ostriches have with other animals in modern science, we call it mutualism. So there's the association between organisms of two different species, which each benefits from. So, and mutualism increases when animals have different living requirements. So it doesn't have to be the same animal or a species or a subspecies. They can be totally different and occupy different aspects of the ecosystem. That's where you're going to see the most powerful mutualism happening, as you can see here, between the ostrich, the zebra, and the gazelle, as and also with other animals. Now, to close this out, we're going to deal with Ma'at and a Medu-Neter primary count, right? I'm going to give you a really, really short grammar lesson here. So this is from an actual primary. Before I get into that, I'm going to say this concept of hexaro. I know I'm butchering the pronunciation, so I apologize. And it talks about an exchange, because Ma'at is actually based on an exchange. And so it's and the people involved in the exchange determine the value of the exchange. So, and what's allowed and what the parameters of that exchange are. As the brother says here, he says, you don't understand our way. 1 string, 5 strings, any return would be all right. You see, we don't trade with things, we trade with people. So what's important about the exchange is that I get what I need and you get what you need. Because when we can do that, we're engaging in a relationship. So it doesn't matter if I give you, 5 stones because you need them, and I may only need 1 sheet of linen that's about 3 feet long. That's an equal exchange. It doesn't matter what you could sell them for at a flea market. What matters is I got what I needed, you got what you needed, so we're good. You can do that in a communal aspect, but when you monetize and capitalize everything to a pernicious effect, this kind of stuff falls apart, and a lot of the rampant consumerism, as well as the abuse of capitalism that we see in the mindfulness industry, this type of model couldn't stand. But to get to the primary text, we're going to look at this non-eclectic particle, iher, which is generally translated as and or further. But what's actually happening is something that's a little different. And this determinative is the indicator of that. So let's take a look and see. All right. This is a primary from a person named Ramesu, who had been promised by 2 people that he would do something for him in exchange for a calf. And so he runs into one of the persons that he did the exchange with. He ran into his wife. And so he went to a scribe, so the scribe could write down his account, because obviously he's, it would be like, it's like having it on record so you could take it to court today. That's what we do. So, Amenhotep basically promised Ramesu. He said, hey, if you give me, I have a calf, and if you give me a coffin, because I need one, I'll give you this calf, as like an exchange. He agreed, Ramesu agrees to it. And but what happens is he gives him the calf, and or he gives him the coffin, and he never gets the calf. Okay. And so at this point in time, the guy left with the coffin, never heard from him. So he was talking to another guy named Paquette. He was telling him about what happened. And Paquette basically says, well, if you give me a bed, I'll give you a calf, and I got a big calf, and I'll give it to you. It's no problem. So he gave him the calf. I mean, he gave him the bed. Never got his calf. So now he's out of a bed in a coffin, and he never got, he never got his end of the exchange. And obviously he's upset about it, right? Because when you look at this word iher, if you look here, for example, iher is found at the beginning of an independent clause where someone is essentially talking about a less than favorable result. So sometimes they're talking about something that's a disaster or something that's unfortunate, but also, as you see here, he says, I don't have a coffin or bed. So, but as you see here at the bottom part, he basically says, if there's no calf, you better make sure to bring back the bed and the coffin. So when you look at this, let's put this into a more modern and the way that we talk, right? Let's put into it like this. So I just use the dialect of English that my people talk, right? And this is how this is communicated. It's the same phrase. Now, you've been in this situation before. We all have, right? When you try to help somebody, they didn't look out for their end of the bargain. So what's happening is this term iher is indicating a violation of ma'at. So basically, this dude Ramesu is basically telling both of these people, he's basically threatening them and telling them that it's in your best interest to bring me back a calf, or it's going to be a problem, right? So that kind of social and that type of social nuance and cultural nuance is lost if you just translate it as and or furthermore or whatever, right? But it's clear just in an African sense what was actually happening there. Okay. And obviously, this brother Ramesu was upset, and he had every right to be. The anger that he felt and the upset feelings he had, and he might have actually wanted to go and put hands on somebody. He was well within his rights to do that, and by him being upset about it or being angry or him feeling like he got to go knock on their door or something like that to handle some business, he is well within the confines of ma'at to do so. It's full stop. Okay. And I'm going to end with these last two quotes here. One of them is from our esteemed elder Theophilo Benga. Without the mastering of the ancient Egyptian language, the task of knowing Kemet with integrity and accuracy be almost senseless. And African historiography will always suffer tremendously from this weakness. So when we want to talk about what Ma'at is, we have to go to the text. That is the best tell. These people will have you out here in the middle of nowhere, on your knees, going humming, doing all kind of crazy stuff, trying to tell you what Ma'at is. But when you put a text in front of them and you can't find them, right? All of a sudden they act like they don't know what you're talking about. We let the Ramesh speak for themselves. Okay. And if you develop a skill set in meta nature, you are more than equipped to deal with a lot of this foolishness that happens in these industries when people start to make claims about Kemet in any kind of way. That's always the great neutralizer. And the last quote is a quote from my beloved grandmother, great grandmother, Beulah Fort, Ma'at Keru. Boy, there's stuff in this world that you need to know, and I can't give it to you because I don't know it. Don't let nobody stop you. Your mama, your teachers, don't let me stop you. You go get it and you fetch it back to your family. All right. That's it. Duau. And I'd like to offer some special venerations to some of my recent ancestors who are no longer here. I hope that with this presentation today, I did your memory well. And I want to give some praise to my teachers, my fellow students when I was learning the meta nature, and also my students who have helped me tremendously in a myriad of ways. And also, that's it. So I'm going to come out and I'm going to stop sharing. And I guess we're going to open the floor for questions, comments, concerns, gripes, and all of that good stuff.
All right. Well, first, let me say thank you so much for that presentation and for showing us the difference between looking at our history and our culture and our way of doing things, as opposed to relying on a lot of these industries that we see that are taking advantage of people. Um, my first question to you is, as I'm thinking of this, right? So there are so many things that can go wrong, and when we're thinking about people who are trying to be well, we're trying to be healthy, and they see all of this stuff that's pushing them toward um, this practice of mindfulness,
Mm,
and then they get into it and they say, wait a minute, this is not what I thought it was.
mm,
Um, why is it that it seems I'm not getting anything out of it? What does this have to do with my culture? Are
mm,
there some ways that we can have more balance, ways that we can practice good mental health and wellness and
mm,
not get caught up in the cash cow that is this industry of
mm,
mindfulness?
mm.
Just maybe
Yeah.
some of your thoughts on that.
Okay. Well, I would lead with what Marimba Ani said, uh, that the way that you deal with the alien culture is by practicing your own.
Hmm.
So, and that's why I try to highlight, for example, how none of this stuff has, they take the stuff they think is cute and they try to play games with it and get themselves, that's just something that they do because that kind of stuff, there's not a lot of people that can read meta nature. And when you have African people who are looking to try to find themselves and things like that, it's really, really easy to draw people in with nonsense. Because if you can't, like, you know, I, right? So the problem then becomes if you tell me that a temple wall somewhere says something, as soon as I ask you where it is, it's already over because of the simple fact that I can go to the wall and we can read it and see if it says what it says. Now, when you get proven wrong, what are you going to do?
Hmm.
Right? You can't fool me because I have a level of acumen with the language. So that's not going to work. It works on people who are trying. You can't blame anybody for trying to find themselves. We've all been trying to do that all our lives, right? Because we've had
Hmm.
so much taken from us.
Yes.
So, so when it comes to that kind of stuff, we're ripe for the picking,
Hmm.
and so the only way that we can really deal with it is to deal with our African selves unfettered with no middleman. And it's hard work. And that's why a lot of times people are drawn to these other things because it's like a get rich quick scheme,
Hmm.
like culturally, oh, I can do this and I can go sit on a rock and I can, make these vibrations and play this music at this frequency and my whole life will change. And it's like if that happened, these people wouldn't be getting rich off of it because you got to keep coming back to them, right? And that's like it's the whole thing. You got to keep coming back to them. If they really had a solution, you know, um, I don't have anything to offer people, or anything. I don't have anything to sell to them. I mean, if you want to learn the meta nature, we can do that. We can help you, but I don't have any pipe dreams to sell you. You
Hmm.
know.
Yeah. And I was really glad that the point that you made when you were talking about the ostrich, that
Mm-hmm.
there is a balance there, right? So I've had people who practice mindfulness tell me that I shouldn't get angry when I hear certain things or see certain things, that I shouldn't be upset, that, oh no, you got to be calm all the
Mm-hmm.
time. And you never are supposed to have emotional responses to what's going on around you. And if you do, then you're not practicing mindfulness. And it's really interesting to hear comments like that because that was
Mm-hmm.
never our way. It was always about balance. Yes,
Yeah,
people can get upset and still be in good mental health.
absolutely.
People can have emotional responses to the things that are going on around them and
Mm-hmm.
still be healthy.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm glad that you pointed that out.
Yeah,
But
and
I'm going to be quiet and see if others have any questions or anything they would like to bring up.
okay. I want to speak to what you just said really, really quickly before we
Yeah,
move
sure.
on. if somebody's telling you that you have to be happy all of the time, how is that balance?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Exactly.
Like, how does that even work? And see, here's the interesting thing, right? Your feelings are directly tied to your intellect.
Mm-hmm.
There really doesn't have to be, it's more of like what's a more appropriate response in a particular situation, but there's no line drawn between your feelings and your intellect. We
Mm-hmm.
see that in the Meta Nature, for example, the word ib.
Mm-hmm.
It
Mm-hmm.
means heart, it means consciousness, it means, you could translate it as mind, or like that kind of thing, inclination, or whatever. So Africans made this connection early on. That's just a fundamental African concept. So the things that I enjoy doing, like I enjoy having research questions and engaging in scholarship, my emotions are directly tied to that,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's ridiculous to think that a person, like my grandmother, peace be upon her, she used to always say, like, whenever I would get upset and I would cry, she would be like, "Ain't nothing wrong with crying. You got tear ducts, don't you?"
Mm-hmm.
Like, why? What's wrong with crying if you got instruments for crying? There's
Mm-hmm.
nothing wrong with it. So yeah, that just strikes me as like really, really weird. That sounds like somebody trying to sell something,
Right.
you know. Like, so yeah, yeah. So yeah, my spider sense starts going off when I hear stuff like that.
Mm. Any other questions or comments? We've got a little bit of time left, just about 10 minutes.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank
Yep,
you. We can hear
loud and
you.
clear.
Hello, Dr. Brandy, um, uh, Brother Lamar, Janet Monk, and everybody else. So I have learned a lot, and so it allows me to think. So there's an ancient Egyptian word, if you want to call it Egypt, but
Mm-hmm.
Tawi, ancient Tawi word. It's called the Geruma.
Mm-hmm.
Geruma is in uh, Ptahhotep and Amenhotep and some of the ancient writing scripts. And it's the silent, self-mastered person.
Mm-hmm.
The silent person uh, goes against this mindfulness because the silent person is thinking, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what Brother Jenna was talking about was cognitive and neural facilities of the human.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't mean that you always have to speak, but you're always thinking, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things the ancient people of this land did was they began to write very expertly. Writing is the only way of immortality. Mindfulness, you disappear, right? Because you're in your own mind and you're not writing, you're not active, right? You're not leaving anything, right? So if you're stuck in that mindset, pun, if you're stuck into that mindset, you're not going to be immortal. There's nothing that you are going to give. And I'm not talking about just having children and things like that. I'm talking about you as an individual and your purpose in this place. There's
Mm-hmm.
another feather figure I thought, just because of lack of time, but is the feather of Shu, which
Mm-hmm.
also an ostrich feather,
Mm-hmm.
and that is another counterpart of the female. Shu is masculine, Ma is female, but they are related.
Mm-hmm.
The other part, of course, is when the people of the Tawi civilization has this great symbolic thing called the weighing of the heart, where the heart mind is weighed against uh, uh, the feather, the ostrich
Mm-hmm.
feather, right? And that this ostrich feather is actually combinations of more than what he said, truth, justice, and righteousness,
Mm-hmm.
but the whole existence. And so there's all these other lessons. And the thing about ancient Egyptian civilization or Tawi civilization, or you want to call it Kemet civilization. And for everybody, when he was talking quick, happy means denial, right?
Mm-hmm.
And these are some advanced terms, is that we have a recording of human observation, right? And our neural and cognitive evolution,
Mm-hmm.
right? At a time where other people like the Sumerians writing in wet clay and uh, and some people think it's great because it's writing, but it's scribble scrabble. Sorry, my light went off. But
Mm-hmm.
but we actually have a record. So mindfulness does not necessarily give you a record, right? And so all of these things. So those are just my comments. Great,
Mm-hmm.
great job, and especially that Ma'at is just not peaceful. Ma'at is necessary action when it occurs to remove what chaos, which is Isfet. So it is a necessary action. Thank you so much. That's the end of my
Mm-hmm.
comments, and the lights went back on.
Ah.
Thank you
Yeah.
for that comment. You looked like you was in witness protection for a minute. Glad you're back. Glad you're back.
Mhm.
Okay. Any other comments or questions?
Yeah, I have a comment.
Mhm.
I just wanted to say thank you for this. And this presentation means so much to me personally. As you know, I think you mentioned before, like a lot of us are just trying to figure out our history and figure out who we are, where we come from. And I'll try to tell the story as
Mhm.
quick as possible. But long story short, I just see like before the pandemic, I would see the number 42 like
Mhm.
everywhere. Like every time I looked at the phone 42, I would screenshot it, me and my partner, and we would talk about it. And like, okay, well,
Mhm.
that's our number. I think we even met April 424. Our daughter was born on the 342. So just special moments and special times in my life. And so the pandemic happened, and then a lot of chaos and stuff just happened in my life. And so the
Mhm.
few months ago, like I would probably say probably like eight, maybe between 5 to 8 months ago, I was just up late, just you know how you're just up and just thinking about things. And something was just like, look up 42, like look it up. It has to be something more to this, right?
Mhm.
And then I seen my aunt. And so I'm like, oh my gosh. And I even screenshot it, wrote it down, sent it to my partner.
Mhm.
And I guess this is a safe, vulnerable space. So just and even just learning more and just going through like what was that number for me, like what was calling out to me, and just even having this conversation in educational quote unquote spaces. Like I come from a public health background, a dietetic background, and never thought to really merge these the African philosophy and the centeredness of health and what that means, and even what that means for me.
Mhm.
And this even like has me thinking like the next step in my life, and even like career, and like really thinking of just this meshing of our history and like what I'm really here to do. It's just a beautiful, this just has been a beautiful layer tonight. And even like, okay, I graduated in December. I had a graduation party, and my best friend's mom brought me this big old gold feather, and it's like
Mhm.
a bracelet.
Mhm.
And the first thing she probably didn't know what she was thinking, because I never told anyone this outside of my partner. That was just between us and a number that we share, and think conversations that we have, and not even knowing really, like I said, just this gradual introduction into my art and this really African centered teaching and learning, and just learning within ourselves. But I have this sacred space in my bedroom where I have like this rose quartz, lapis lazuli, this candle, and then I put this gold. And as soon as I see it, like I said, I did my art, and then I put this gold, um, the bracelet right by like this sacred space. My aunt, to me, like the goddess, and she had the feather, and I'm thinking like I need this order in my life from this all this chaos, and really just combining what I know, like what my spirit is saying, and the
Mm-hmm.
religiosity, like right, and so all of these things, I say that to say thank you for explaining and really going into detail with the ostrich, because I'm like calling for justice in my life and with my family. But this like warrior, this really war, um, and thinking like my is peaceful, but it is at the same time calling this energy that just learning and unfolding just how spirit works has just been amazing. So thank you so much. I would love to stay in touch, or even if you give any other the more talks anywhere else, just let me know. Dr. Faulkner too, because this is great and just definitely helping my spiritual journey and just
Mm-hmm.
figuring stuff out.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. Yeah, duau for your kind words, and for your story. Yeah, and I'll tell you something else too. Excuse me. You know, the gestation period for ostrich eggs is on average is about 42 days, right? So, um, I think that it's possible that the significance of that number when they talk about the 42, or even if you go back before that, because that's like a new kingdom advent, right? But if you go back before that, you have like the 42 gnomes, or the 42 regions within Kemet. It's possible that that's where that number comes from. I can't confirm or deny it, but it's possible, right? But yeah, I mean, you have to start somewhere, right? So whatever it is that does it for you, like for some people, something I'll tell you, like speaking to you, how stuff just kind of comes when you're able to accept it, right? So sometimes we're not all in the same place, to accept things, and that's cool. Just wherever you are is where you are, because we all have to kind of take that walk, so it's nothing to be ashamed of, or anything like that. And that kind of, and you're not alone with that. Your story is actually pretty typical. And so whenever you're ready to take that step, you take it. But I just always tell people, it's no turning back. It's like it's either you keep going forward, or you be a Sambo, right? So there's really, that's really all you have. So and I'll tell you now, it's not for the weak of heart. You're gonna read things that really upset you, you know, and that's the way that it should be, because if everything you're reading makes you feel good, you're probably not doing it right. So I'll tell you that. I'll tell you that straight. But what I will do is I'm putting my email in the chat for anybody who needs it. I'm always available to talk to people and things like that, because I enjoy this kind of discourse. So even if I'm just listening, I enjoy it. So yeah, duau for your contribution, and those types of contributions are important, so always, it's always good to share. So duau, I thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you, Joanna.
Thank you.
All right, we are out of time. I really appreciate you for coming. There'll be a replay of this recording on Thursday for all of my students, and I know some other professor students who couldn't make it in tonight.
Mm-hmm.
And then we will also in the future have a part 2 of this discussion that focuses more on the African-centered approaches to wellness, some very practical things that we can do to make sure that we are taking care of ourselves and staying in our proper frame of cultural reference. So I once again want to thank Lamar very, very much for being here and for doing this wonderful presentation for us. And I know that it was very useful for the people who are here, and for those who will be listening to the recording, I know they'll get a lot out of it as well. So with that, we will end, and I will say good night to you all, and hope to see you the rest of this week as we continue our Africana Studies programming. And take care, and we'll see you later. Good night, everybody.